I woke up one night and it was freezing cold. The air around me was freezing cold because the waterbed's warm. And I woke up, and at the foot of my bed was a black hooded figure with glowing eyes.
So, once again, you found yourself at the campsite of the Orator. But please pull up your chair. As you can see, my fire is stoked, which means tonight I have another tale to tell. But before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, then allow the spirits to guide your planchette to both the like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell. That way you get notified every time I upload new content, and it allows me to continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. Second, all of my stories are first-hand accounts of the supernatural and paranormal. So, if you or someone you know has a story that might fit well on my channel, you can either reach out in the comments below or on any of my social media. We'll find a time to get together, collect your story, and hopefully feature it one day here on The Orator. And lastly, in the month of June, I have a contest, a giveaway contest going on. How can you win? It's very simple. Any video in the month of June that you comment on gives you one entry. Multiple comments on one video still only count as one entry, but if you comment on multiple videos throughout the month of June, that's multiple entries. What do you win if you win? Well, at the end, I'm going to draw 7 names out of a hat, and those 7 lucky winners are going to get a custom-made Orator trading card. These things are really, really well made. The quality is excellent. They have each been custom burned in the Orator's campfire, so each one is individually numbered and is unique. They're made by a company called Jack's Attic, who specializes in horror pop weirdness, specifically trading cards that are horror themed. They do lots of other cool stuff. I'll link their website. You should totally check it out. But they have lots of really cool stuff. So make sure to leave a comment on this video. Go back through all of my other videos in the month of June. Leave your comments there. And if you get your name pulled, I will reach out. We'll find a way to send you your trading card, and I will send it in the mail, and you'll get a free trading card. No strings attached. They're really, really awesome. So get involved in that. And now, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to today's story. It is a tale that I call The Inheritance. Between the cities of Christiansburg and Blacksburg in Virginia lies a tiny town called Merrimack. It's home to only about 2,000 people. And all the way back in the 70s, Cathy lived there. Now, Cathy in the 70s, she was about 8 years old, and she was starting to come to terms with the fact that she had certain abilities that other people didn't have. She didn't really know exactly how to describe them, and later on one of her sisters told her that she had basically inherited this ability that was passed down the family line. Her great-grandma had it. It didn't always hit every single person, but they had a lineage of this ability, and basically they were able to do different things. Some people could talk to spirits. Some people had premonitions. Some people had gut instincts and feelings about stuff that was going to happen. And so, they knew that this was something that traveled throughout the family. And Cathy, at 8 years old, was just starting to understand that she had inherited this ability. And one of the things that happened was she would get these really strong, intuitive gut feelings. Sometimes they were in dreams. Sometimes they were in the waking world. But when they happened, they foretold something, and she kind of got pretty good at figuring out what was going on. So the first time that this happened, she's 8 years old, and she has this really vivid dream about her cousin's house burning down while they're out of the house. And she, in the dream, knows that everybody's gone, but they lose the house, obviously, and then they lose all of their possessions. And when she wakes up from this dream, it's just such a different feeling than any dream she's ever had. She could just tell that this wasn't necessarily a dream. This was a premonition. This was something warning her about something bad that was coming. And so she right then calls her cousin, and she just tells them, listen, you need to move the stuff that you love out of your house because I'm afraid it's going to burn down when you're not there. Now, unfortunately, being an 8-year-old girl, most people did not listen to her. Her cousin didn't, unfortunately. And about a week later, they were out at the grocery store. The entire family was gone, and their house burned down along with all of their possessions inside. And it was kind of at that point that Cathy really did internalize the fact that she just had these certain abilities that other people didn't have. Another time, and this is a little bit later, it's 1998, she's now in her early 30s. And Cathy, she was adopted. And even though she was adopted, at some point her adoptive parents sat her down and they told her who her biological parents were. And her biological father was somebody that she knew as her uncle. And they were really, really close. And they hung out all the time. And after they kind of discussed it, he just took on a bigger role in her life. And they were very close. And she knew the circumstances under which she was adopted. And there was no ill will there or anything like that. And so they were really close. Well, unfortunately, her father contracted cancer, and they knew that it was terminal. And so she kind of knew that it was coming, but one day she's at work, and she just gets this feeling. And she said, the only way I can describe it is if you've ever been punched really hard in the gut, and it drives the wind out of you and leaves you breathless and aching, that's what it felt like, except it felt like the punch was coming from inside instead of coming from outside. And she said, whenever I got that feeling specifically, I knew it was something really bad. And she said, as soon as it happened, I knew that it was my dad had passed. She's like, I was positive of it. She's like, but I finished my shift and everything like that. Then I went home, and she said the first thing I did when I got home is I called over to his house. Now, obviously, it would be like her uncle's house. And she calls over there, and it's a total stranger who picks up because obviously they had already found out what had happened. And sure enough, this guy picks up and he says, hello. And she just says, hey, can I talk to so-and-so, my uncle? And he says, unfortunately, your uncle passed earlier from cancer. And so it happened, when he passed, it was basically the exact same time that she had that gut feeling. So she knew already, but she said, it didn't make it any less devastating, especially hearing it from a stranger. And so that kind of irked her. But she had these abilities for her entire life. And instead of being scared of them or resenting them or seeing them as some sort of curse or something like that, honestly, Cathy just sort of leaned into it, and she just found that she really was interested in the paranormal, and she wanted to learn more about the paranormal. So much so that in the late 70s, so she's now like in her early teens at this point, she and a bunch of friends, she has 3 other friends, they come over, and they buy a Ouija board. Now, they go to, like, this store, their local store, and they buy one of those cardboard ones, right? You can buy them for, like, $15-20, and they're not made out of great material or anything like that, but it's still a spirit talking board, and they still can be very dangerous, as Cathy and her friends found out that night. So, they take their spirit board, they go down into the basement, of course. And anytime you're doing a talking board or a spirit board, the general idea is to give it as creepy a vibe as possible. Low light, stuff like that. And they did exactly that. They turned off all the lights, they lit a couple of candles, and they're sitting around, and they're trying to do all of the stuff that you would normally do when you're using a spirit board. You're supposed to ask specific questions. Are there any spirits in the room with us? Are there any presences here? Would you like to make yourselves known? And oftentimes you hear stuff like knocking or walking or sometimes even talking. All sorts of crazy stuff happen. None of that happened. They're all playing and they're moving the planchette around and nothing's really happening. They're kind of creeping themselves out and they're just sort of having a fun time like what happens with most people. And then at some point, they all take their hands off the planchette and they're sort of done with the game and they're just sort of sitting around talking about it when all of a sudden, the planchette starts to move on its own. No one is touching it. And they're all just sort of staring there, terrified, mesmerized, as the planchette slowly slides around the board and it just spells out David. D-A-V-I-D. And they didn't know if that was a person or what. Now, this is the house that her father built and she grew up in it. So it's not like there was like a ghost that had inhabited that place before or anything like that. So the fact that there was something moving the planchette was really scary because it's not like it was something that was already there. It's potentially something that they brought into their realm. And that can always be a really terrifying thing. So that, they don't know necessarily about all that, but they're super freaked out about the fact that this planchette moved and they know that they've done something wrong and that this is potentially dangerous. So they gather up the planchette, they gather up the talking board, they run upstairs, Cathy goes and gets lighter fluid, like what you would use to start a grill or something like that. They set the Ouija board outside, they douse it in the lighter fluid, and they light it on fire. And after all of this lighter fluid, all this fuel is burned off of it, this talking board, which is made of cardboard, is not marred in any way. It's not burnt. There's no soot on it. It's not singed. It didn't peel away any paint. This thing looks as if it just came out of the box. And they just start freaking out. And Cathy folds it up and gives it to her friend and says, "Get it out of here." And they do. They take it away. And actually, Cathy said, "I have no clue what happened to it after that. I don't know if they destroyed it or threw it away or what." She said, "I just wanted it away from my home, and I never wanted to deal with it again." And luckily, after that, really nothing happened. They didn't have any activity or anything like that in their house for a really long time. But Cathy remembered that she really avoided that basement at all costs. She said, "I would go down in the basement with a group of friends, but I just wouldn't go down there alone." Until her 16th birthday. So it's her 16th birthday, and for her birthday, you know, her sweet 16, you got to do something big. Her parents bought her a waterbed. Now you have to understand, back then, late 70s, early 80s, waterbeds were like the coolest thing ever. They're basically like, if you've never seen a waterbed, it's like a normal looking bed. It's got a big, usually really thick, heavy wooden bed frame, but then it's got this like big rubber pouch that sits in it, and then you fill that thing up with water, almost like a giant water balloon, and then it's heated. And it's awesome. It's really comfortable. It's great to sleep on and everything like that. They've obviously completely fallen out of style, especially because they're dangerous, because it's gallons and gallons and gallons of water, and if you puncture one of them, it can be devastating to your house if all that water pours out and spills out. And so because of that, because they were kind of a dangerous thing to sleep on, they said, you know, you obviously can't have this like in your bedroom, because if it breaks, it would destroy our floorboards and stuff like that. So you have to take it to the basement. And so she kind of is like in this mental fight of like, do I want to go down in the basement and sleep down there? But they just got me this waterbed and it would be awesome. I've wanted a waterbed forever. And eventually she decides she is going to go down and move into the basement, but she's going to light that thing up like a Christmas tree. She's got night lights everywhere when she goes to sleep. And so she moves down in the basement. She's got her awesome waterbed, lights everywhere, so that when she goes to bed, it's a well-lit room. And for years, nothing happens. And she feels comfortable-ish down there throughout the years because nothing ends up happening. Until one night, about 2-3 years later, she's 18, 19 years old, and she all of a sudden wakes up in the middle of the night, and she's, you know, rubbing the sleep from her eyes and everything like that. And she realizes that, you know, she's got this hot waterbed, and that feels good, but it is freezing in the basement. And it doesn't really make sense. It's not cold outside. They don't have the air conditioner blaring or anything like that. It should not be cold in here. And she's like, wow, it is freezing in here. So she's like looking around thinking maybe I need to grab an extra blanket or something like that. And she's finally starting to wake up when all of a sudden she realizes at the foot of her bed is this person. And they're really, really tall. And they're completely cloaked in blackness. And she can't really see anything except she sees that they have two bright red glowing eyes and they are staring at her. And she is just terrified. And so she closes her eyes and she says the Lord's Prayer, and then she says the 23rd Psalm. Now these are both obviously pretty famous, right? Most people are familiar with the Lord's Prayer. Most people are familiar with the 23rd Psalm. The Lord's Prayer, of course, starts, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Most people are familiar with that, and they're also familiar with the 23rd Psalm, which has the lines, you know, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil." Most people are familiar with those, so they're pretty popular. She closes her eyes, she says both of those, and she opens them, and when she opens her eyes, she sees this figure in front of her literally like dissipate, sort of just like fade away. And she knows she's not asleep, and she knows that she definitely saw it. By the time that she had seen this thing, you know, number one, her room is well lit. There's all these nightlights all over. So it's not like she saw a shadow that was deeper than black. Her room, she could see. And also, you know, she had already rubbed the sleep out of her eyes and was kind of looking around and stuff like that. So she was like already awake when she saw this thing. And so after that, it really, really freaked her out. Luckily, she didn't have to wait very long because, she was getting old enough to where she moved out on her own. And a couple years later, in 1990, she ended up getting married, and in 1992, her and her husband bought a house. Now, the house that they purchased was interesting. It used to belong to her husband's grandparents, all right? And her husband's grandma died in that house. She passed away in the early 80s and stuff like that, and then that house got passed down to her husband's parents, and then they ended up leaving that house, and it got foreclosed on, and then they got it back from the bank. So they basically inherited this house from her husband's parents. And this house, it had a couple problems. Number one, obviously, grandma passed away in the house, so that was like already a little spooky. It was built on a slave graveyard. So all the way back, in American history when we had slaves, unfortunately, when they passed away, they weren't allowed to go in normal cemeteries. And so one of a couple things happened. They either got buried on the land somewhere, or they would get put in these tiny plots that were specifically designated to slaves, or sometimes they would be put on the outskirts of the cemetery of the family who owned the slaves, or whatever the case is. Well, for whatever reason, this house was built right over one of those slave graveyards, and because of that, both her husband's parents and grandparents had reported that there was some weird stuff going on in the house. Well, when they finally get this house back from the bank, like I said, it's in pretty big disrepair, and so they need to kind of go through and fix some stuff. They need to paint, they need to clean stuff up, they need to repair a few things here and there, and so before they even moved in, a lot of their days looked like after work, they would come over, they would work on the house or whatever, and then they would literally eat dinner and stuff like that while they were there working, and then at some point they would get tired, they'd have to go back to their other home. And while they were doing that working and stuff like that, they didn't have a dining room table or chairs or any of that stuff. The house was gutted and they hadn't refurnished it until it was fixed and ready to go. And so they would literally just sort of like in the kitchen area, sit down on the floor and eat takeout or whatever. And oftentimes they would leave all their silverware and stuff like that in the kitchen when they left. And then the next day when they returned, all of the stuff, all of the clutter, all of the mess that they had left in the living room that they were intending to clean the next morning when they got there was picked up and put away, either put in the trash, or if there was dishes, they were put in the sink. And, Cathy remembers I would ask my husband, and then after, they had a son at that point, and their son was a couple years old, and they even asked him, like, did you do something like, did you do this? And then they would obviously pay attention because it happened pretty frequently. And then, of course, eventually at some point, they fixed everything up, and they moved in. And once they moved into the house, it was kind of the same thing. They would hear a lot of different things. They would hear running around when no one was, upstairs or whatever the case was. They would hear a lot of movement in the kitchen and stuff like that. But the biggest thing that they would see that was kind of a recurring thing was the dishes. If for some reason anything was left anywhere other than the kitchen and it was supposed to be in the kitchen, it would get picked up and put back in the kitchen by whatever this entity was. In fact, Cathy remembers this one time, she left some dirty dishes in the sink and she had to run an errand or whatever. And when she came back from that errand, all of the stuff that was in the sink that was dirty and not put away was put away in the dish rack but had not yet been cleaned. And so she, of course, asked her husband, asked her son, who's only like 3, so it's probably not him. And they both were like, did not know what she was talking about. And so she reluctantly takes all of the dishes out of the dish drying rack, and she washes them, and then she puts them back. And then she goes and sits down. Now, what's interesting about this house is it sat near some railroad tracks, and it was also near one of these back roads where 18-wheelers would go through. And it was close enough to the road and the tracks that either time an 18-wheeler or a train went by, it would kind of rattle the house a little bit. And so she's sitting there, and all of a sudden she hears the silverware in the kitchen start rattling. And she's thinking, oh, a truck must be going by or a train must be going by. And so she's listening, but she doesn't hear either one of those things, which are normally very loud. And so she goes and she looks out the window to the road, and she doesn't see any trucks. And she's looking towards the tracks, and she doesn't see any train. But this whole time, this silverware is just rumbling in the kitchen. Until at some point, she kind of realizes what's going on. And she walks in, and she just addresses the kitchen. She says, listen, I know you're upset. I'm sorry I took your dishes out, but they were dirty, and I needed to clean them. I put them back so you could calm down. And immediately, as soon as she said that, it stopped. The dishes just stopped rattling. But that was like just a common occurrence, and she said still to this day it's a common occurrence. They have to make sure everything is clean, and if it's not, then whatever the spirit is, it's going to put some stuff away. The other spirit that was in that house was, of course, the spirit of her grandmother-in-law, her husband's grandma. And she was really straightforward. She passed away upstairs in her bedroom, and oftentimes they would hear her walking around upstairs, and then they would hear her start coming down the stairs. And anytime they came down the stairs, either Cathy or her husband would say, "Don't worry, Ma, it's just us. We're down here, you're fine." And whatever it was, that entity would just stop. And then they wouldn't hear it for a while after that. And so that was a common spiritual thing that happened. Another thing that happened, when they first moved in, about a year or two after they moved in, they had a friend who had to come and live with them. His name was Mark. And so Mark, he stayed in one of the spare rooms, and at some point, Mark passed away in that bedroom. And, obviously it was kind of devastating. He was a really close friend of theirs. And then, eventually, after he was gone and everything was taken care of, and this is 2 or 3 years later at this point, their son, who's now maybe like 5, 6 years old, he's moved into that bedroom. And so he's in that bedroom, and one night he comes out to Cathy, his mom, and he just says, "Mom, there's a man in my bedroom." And so she goes in there, and she's checking. She does all the normal stuff. She checks under the bed, she checks the closet, and she's like, "Sweetie, I don't know. There's nobody here." Which is very common. Obviously, all kids think there's monsters or somebody in their bedroom. And so she makes sure and she checks, and there's nothing weird. And so she leaves. She goes back out of the living room, and then the next morning, she asks her son, like, "Was everything okay after I left?" He said, "No, the man came back, and he was in my bedroom the entire night." And her mom all of a sudden realizes that it's possible that could be Mark. And so she tells her son, "Listen, our friend Mark used to live in that room. He passed away. You just have to tell him. Say, 'Hey, Mark, I'm Cathy's son. This is my bedroom now. You're going to stay at the room at the end of the hall," which was the new spare bedroom. And so literally that night, obviously he's a 5 or 6-year-old, so it's hard to say, but it seems as though he's inherited certain abilities from Cathy and her grandmother and all that. And now he's able to see spirits because he said, the man came, he said exactly what Cathy told him to say, and he said, and then the spirit turned around and left my room. And since then, they haven't had a single issue with the bedroom. Now, the other thing about Mark is he was a smoker, and he obviously never smoked in the house. So what they would do is they would have him go outside, and he would always go out through the kitchen door. And oftentimes, when they were sitting around, they would hear that kitchen door slide open and then slide closed. And even if they were watching it, they could hear it, but it never actually slid open and closed. But they could hear it doing that, and every time it happened, it sort of like brought a smile to their face, like, "Oh, it looks like Mark's going out to smoke again." And so even though they had a lot of these different spirits and stuff like that, none of them seemed really malicious, but they were always very present. And, even to this day, Cathy is, a lover of the paranormal and supernatural. A few years ago, in the 20-teens, her and a friend of hers, they went on a paranormal investigation hunt. They went to Bluefield State College, and there's this place called Mahood Hall. And in Mahood Hall, there was a fire, and a young girl passed away in that fire. And so, there's a lot of paranormal investigative hunts that happen in Bluefield State College, Mahood Hall, because of that. And there's apparently been a lot of activity. And so they go in with a team, and basically the idea is they have a lot of equipment. They sweep and try to check for activity. They set up cameras, all sorts of stuff. And so they do that throughout the night. They don't really see anything. And then at some point, they have all the cameras set up, and Cathy and her friends sit down, and they are just watching the cameras to see if they see anything. And while they're sitting there watching, behind them, they suddenly hear, "Woo," and they stop, and they both turn around, and they get up and go look, and there's no one there, and they know where all the other team members are, and none of them are even close. And so they just try to communicate with them. "Is there anybody here? Can you hear us?" And there's literally nothing. And so at some point, they're like, "All right, I guess not." They go, they sit down, and the second that they sit down, all of a sudden they hear, "Hello?" And they turn around, and once again, there's nobody there. And they know where everybody else is, so they know it's not somebody like messing with them or something. And there's just nobody around, and they don't understand exactly what happened. And then they go, and they sit back down, and they're looking at the cameras. And while they're watching the cameras, there's all these different cameras on the different floors and sections and stuff like that. And Cathy, out of the corner of her eye, sees that on the second floor, this little, what appears to be a little girl, peeks around a corner. And she said, she was like a black shadowy outline, so I couldn't tell for sure. She said, but it looked like she had a dress on. The outline looked like a little girl. And then she, boop, popped her head back around the corner and was gone. And Cathy all of a sudden got that feeling again. And she turns to her friend. She said, did you see that girl? And her friend says, no. She said, don't worry. She's going to do it again. She's going to pop her head out from around that corner. Watch. And they both watch that camera. And not 2 seconds later, that girl pops her head back around. And they're both watching that camera and see her do it. And they see her pop around. And she's just kind of looking around the corner like she's kind of seeing if it's okay to go around. And then once again, she turns, she goes back around the corner and they can't see her again. And so, Cathy, to this day, she's a grandmother at this point. She spends most of her time knitting and stuff like that. In fact, she has a great YouTube channel where she talks about knitting and all that. I will link that stuff below because she's been awesome and such a great story and a participant and all that stuff. And I want you guys to go support her. But, man, to this day, even as a grandma and stuff like that, she says, I love the ability to be able to experience different things that other people can't, and I love the thrill of the supernatural, and that's why she ended up talking to me, and she, follows this channel, because even though, she's at a grandmotherly age and stuff like that, she just loves this stuff. And so she said, the house we still live in, it still has activity, and none of it ever bothers me. I love it. I'm very happy to have these abilities, and I hope that my son follows in my footsteps. And so that's going to do it for today's story. If you did find yourself enjoying this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, that allow the spirits to guide your planned check, to both the like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell, so you get notified every time I upload new content. Also, these are first-hand accounts of the supernatural and paranormal. So if you or anybody you know has a story that might fit well on my channel, please either reach out in the comments below or on any of my social media. We'll find a time to get together, collect your story, and hopefully feature it one day here on the Orator. And lastly, of course, make sure to comment on this video and all of the other videos in June for your chance to win a custom Orator trading card. All right, guys, until next time, where you will pull up your chair, my fire will be stoked, and I will have another tale to tell.